Now I just have this basic vocal that I recorded, but you can tell that it's very dynamic. We have quieter parts and we have louder parts. And the reason that vocals are so dynamic is because when you're recording vocals, you can be really far away from the microphone, you can be really close to the microphone, and you can have parts that are needing more power to be singing them, and they can be louder, and you have maybe talking parts that are quieter, etc. There's lots of dynamics behind vocals, and a way that we can combat this is not by using just one compressor, by using multiple. So we can squish the dynamics of the louder parts and control also the quieter parts, and not just rely on one compressor for that. So right here we have two compressors on the vocal, and we're going to go ahead and first just listen to the one. Test, 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 test. I'm going to have a pretty light ratio, maybe 3.7. I'm going to reduce the loudest parts of the signal by at least 3 or 4 decibels, and then I'm going to use the makeup gain to make that louder again. So my ratio is set to 3.7, so it's not too heavy. Test, 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 test. You can see that the loudest parts are being reduced more than the quieter parts. So now what we can do is turn on our makeup gain, and it will increase the volume of the overall compression to the compressed signal to make up for the reduced gain. And now we can go into our second compressor and add a little bit more compression to make up for the overall sound. I also want to have a pretty quick attack and a pretty quick release so that we can be controlling the initial transients of the vocal. Then I'm going to go into my second compressor and I'm going to put a lighter ratio and a slower attack. Test, 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 test. Test, 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 test. Test, 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 test. And my initial idea here is I want to be reducing the overall sound, but just by a few dB. Test, 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 test. And this is just to glue it all together a little bit better. And now click on our makeup gain, and it should sound a little bit more glued. Test, 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 test. Test, 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 test. Test, 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 test. Before. Test, 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 test. And after. Test, 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 test. The overall sound is much closer in dynamic range. The quieter parts are closer to the louder parts, but they still remain with a bit of dynamics, and they're not just all the same volume. Test, 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 test. Test, 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 test.